Number 6.
I'm a male, 23 years old, and live in a small town in Norway. My English may be off at some points due to not being my main language. At the time of this story, it was summer, and I decided to travel back home to my parents as the university I was studying at gave us a pretty long summer break. I was excited to see my family again as I hadn't seen them since Christmas, and even though the train journey took about 9 hours, I enjoyed the trip thanks to my brilliant playlist on Spotify. It had been 3 years since I lived with my parents, and I loved living alone, but thankfully they had a basement, which was basically an apartment. I had my own bathroom, living room, and kitchen. You can't get to the upper floor of the house without going outside, walking up some stairs and enter the main entrance to the second floor. And vice versa, my parents couldn't enter the basement without going outside, down the stairs and in through the front door. This is quite important. So the basement is pretty much secluded from the rest of the house, and you feel that it really is its own apartment. So I got home, and before I even got through the door, my mum welcomed me and told me that she was happy I managed to get home before she and my dad left for their trip. Shit, I totally forgot. My parents were going to Spain for 2 weeks on vacation with my grandmother. I had nothing against being alone in the house though, and I knew it was the perfect opportunity to invite some friends and host a little party. So the first night went absolutely fine. I slept like a baby and even woke up early enough to drive my parents to the airport. Wishing them a safe trip, I headed back home from dropping them off. I spent the entire day on the computer playing Counter-Strike with my friends. I had brought my PC from uni and it was a solid gaming laptop. Now, to help you understand a little better, I'll explain the layout of the apartment. Once you enter, there's a long hallway, and if you go straight forward, you get to my bedroom, which means you can lie in my bed and watch the entrance door. The bathroom is to the right in the long hallway before the bedroom, while the living room is to the left. The entrance to the living room was basically right next to the bedroom. So I was sitting in the living room playing on my computer before I realized that it was dark outside. I had been playing the entire day and now I started to feel tired. I headed to my bedroom and fell asleep almost instantly. Suddenly though, I wake up after hearing a noise I still can't explain. It was so clear, but yet so hard to describe. Imagine the sound coming from a light bulb hit with a needle. It was that clear sound of metal on glass. It sounded like the noise came from my bedroom, right next to my ear to be honest. It was so clear, and it instantly woke me up. I turned on the light in my bedroom and looked around for what could have caused the strange sound. I was home alone, and we didn't have any pets, and the closest neighbours lived about 1 kilometre away. I should also probably mention that it was 2:30 AM. I couldn't see anything or anyone who could have caused the sound, but to my surprise, the entrance to the door to the apartment was open. At first, this made me a little bit anxious, but then I realized that I had had it open the entire day. It was open because it got so hot earlier on while I was playing on the computer. Despite it being Norway, our summers are usually warm, and I must have just forgotten to close and lock the door before I fell asleep. I sighed in relief as I started to walk towards the door to close it before going back to sleep. As I passed the entrance to the living room, my heart almost jumped out of my chest. Just as I passed the living room, music starts playing loudly from inside it. It was so loud that I was sure the entire town could hear it. I had my PC hooked up to some speakers, but I never had them turn that loud. And how did the music just randomly start on its own at that exact point? It was a woman that sung opera in a high-pitched tone. I had never heard the song before, and I for sure didn't have it on any of my playlists. The title was Secret Garden, and to my surprise, the music wasn't being played from Spotify, but from YouTube. What the fuck? How was that possible? Had someone noticed the open door, snuck their way past my bedroom, opened my PC and decided that it was a good idea to turn on some opera music on YouTube? I didn't understand any of this, but I quickly exited the browser, killing the loud music. I then walked through the long hallway and closed the entrance door. I turned on all the lights and searched every room in the basement, and as I'm sure you're aware, I didn't find anyone or anything. I even looked for footprints in the hallways. It had a white carpet, which shows tracks easily. I don't know how to explain this. I can still remember that sound that woke me up so clearly, like soft chimes from metal on glass. I also figured that it couldn't have been some intruder who entered the apartment and decided to use my PC to play some music from YouTube, because the music started just as I walked by the living room and there was nobody there. And before you comment that someone hacked me or used TeamViewer or something, there's no way. I have worked in IT for 2 years and know my way around a computer. I didn't have any viruses or any software installed to let someone external take control of my computer. And that still wouldn't explain the noise that woke me up, which I know didn't come from my computer. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, but this experience made me think about it. I'm not religious, and I would very much say I'm a man of science. I study psychology, and I am aware of the ways our brains can fool us into thinking we hear something or see something that isn't real. But this wasn't like that. The sound that woke me up was so clear, and I was wide awake when I heard those 3 chimes. I don't really know how to explain the music that suddenly started to blast as I walked past the entrance to the living room. I never heard or experienced anything like this after that. My mum constantly complains about the light bulbs dying in the basement, even though she just changed them. This only happens in the basement, and I'm sure there is a logical reason, but I dare you to explain my own experience.
Number 5.
It all started around July of 2016. I was having a sleepover with my friend on a Friday night. We'll call my friend Jay for privacy reasons. Jay had around 15 acres of land, 4 acres of that being a forest. We like to set up our tents in his forest and go camping there sometimes. So we set up our tent under a giant tree. This particular tree had weird dream catchers on it. No one knew how they got there or why they were there, not even his family. It was around 12:30 when we decided to walk up their driveway, so we gathered our flashlights and headed over. Once we got there, we started to walk the driveway, and we got this weird feeling in our stomachs, and it just got stronger and stronger the more we walked. Our flashlights also started to flicker and went out at the end of the driveway, so we decided to just go back to the tent. Once we got back, however, we noticed something a little odd. We put our backpacks back into our tent and decided to walk around the tent. What we found, I'll never forget. There was glass and string on the ground, and when we looked up, there were no dream catchers left. They were on the ground, all crushed. We just assumed it was the wind and went back into the tent. It was now around 2:30 a.m, so we decided we should head to bed. As we were falling asleep, we could hear leaves crunching. I assumed it was Jay's dad because he liked to scare us. But when Jay yelled out, "Dad, we know it's you. You can go get a life now," we heard no response. So we thought it was an animal. But as we listened, we could tell that this thing only had 2 legs. The walking continued for an hour and a half, walking around our tent. I looked out when I had had enough, and when I decided to look out the tent window, I could hear footsteps near the door. However, when I peeked out the window, there was nothing there. No trace of anything or anyone. And when I laid back down, there were no sounds. Nothing. The next morning, we went up to Jay's dad, and Jay told him, "Nice try scaring us last night." I then also said, "Why were you even out there for that long?" I paused to see a confused look on Jay's dad's face. I continued, "You were out there for an hour and a half, for crying out loud." When Jay's dad had a chance to speak, he said, "What do you mean? I was sleeping all night. I wouldn't go out for that long." At this point, Jay had a worried look on his face. So did I. Unfortunately, I had to leave his house before we could figure anything out. It was around a month later. Jay and I had forgotten everything that had happened. We were having another sleepover, and at the time, I had a cast on my foot, so we couldn't do much. I was using my crutches instead of my wheelchair because it was too much of a hassle to bring it over. It was a Friday night. Once again, it was 12:30 in the morning. We were bored, and Jay's parents said that we couldn't go outside, but we decided to sneak out anyway. This was a hard task with my crutches and my cast, but somehow we did it without being caught. Again, we started to walk up the driveway. We were talking about stuff normal teens do, but as we walked further down, we got that weird feeling in our stomachs again. When this happened, I immediately remembered what happened the night of the dream catchers. We heard a loud bang from the end of the driveway, so we looked in panic, and we saw what looked like 3 eyes. I felt like I couldn't move. I was just standing there. Jay was yelling at me that we had to go back. Then I realized what had happened and snapped out of it and went back to the house. Nothing else happened that night. We decided to have another sleepover on September 16th of 2016. This was the day that I got my cast off, so it was perfect. Although my muscles were weak, I could barely walk, so I suffered through it. This night, we were prepared for this thing. We set up our tent back in the woods, but this night, nothing really weird happened. It was now October 8th of 2016. Jay, one of Jay's friends who we'll call Will, and I were hanging out together. We did some fun stuff like eat 10 warheads at once. After some fun, and as night was setting in, we were talking and then heard some rattling in his barn. It kind of sounded like a door shutting or something. We went silent before we walked up to the barn, and I got a knife out and ready while Will and Jay followed behind me. His barn was 2 stories high. We were in the top floor earlier in the day, and when we came down, we made sure to close up the door to the stairwell. When we got in, we noticed 2 things. The first thing was that the door to the stairwell was open, and the second was that we heard footsteps on the floor to the upstairs. So I walked into the stairwell and led the way up the stairs, step by step. When we got up there was no one up there. I looked into his yard and I saw something white. I blinked and it moved. I looked one more time, but it was gone. I told them what I saw and we headed that way. By now, Will was begging for us to go back to the house, but we refused. Then Jay yelled out, "Run!" So we ran back. I asked what the hell he saw and he responded with, It was something in a white outfit, glowing white, with 3 eyes. I got a worried look on my face. Will asked what the hell was going on, and we explained everything, and he freaked out and left Jay's house. Now, I wish I could say that this was the end, but it's not. We had a sleepover at my house on October 22nd of 2016. Nothing weird happened that night, but it seemed to have started something. Every night since then, Jay and I have been hearing screaming when our family can't. The latest things that have happened have been destructive. At Jay's house, he saw a white figure near his barn. He blinked and it was gone, and one of his sheep laid on the ground dead. On October 27th of 2016, I was drinking a can of Dr. Pepper and I left to go get something. When I came back, the can was upside down and the pop was spilled all over my desk. Luckily, it didn't go on my computer. I have no idea what's going on.
Number 4.
I live in Canada, near the escarpment, which is a mountainous area full of trees. Beside the escarpment are large fields of farms. My uncle worked at one of these farms. One summer, when I was 9 years old, he took my 3 cousins and me to work with him, with the permission of his employer. We were allowed to play, but we were told not to go towards the sparse forest that went down the land from the mountains to the road. We were also told not to go along the road to the other side of the forest because there was an abandoned barn there, according to my uncle. After this little pep talk, they all set off to work and we played in the cornfields. We were playing hide and seek, but as we played, we slowly crept closer and closer to the forest, and eventually, the game ended up in the forest. By the time we were playing in the forest, it was already late afternoon. Once it was my turn to hide, I ran off far to the end of the forest. I was greeted by a large barn that was a faded red. Its roof had collapsed and it had holes in its walls. Being the smartass I thought I'd hide in the barn, knowing that it would be the perfect hiding spot. In my mind, I was thinking of bragging about being brave and cool as I went to the back of the barn, into a stable and sat in the corner. It had a weird smell, but I ignored it. The smell could be endured for victory's sake. Being narcoleptic, I fall asleep in comfortable environments very easily, and at the time, the barn was very comfortable. When I woke up, it was completely dark. I figured my cousins couldn't find me and had given up. I felt some disappointment that they couldn't find me in my awesome hiding spot. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed that I wasn't alone. Right in front of me, across to the other side of the wall, was a man, just sitting there, staring at me. I remember he looked young but extremely tired. I was frightened because I felt something off about him. I almost even screamed, but nothing came out though. I took deep breaths and mentally prepared myself for anything. I did Taekwondo, so I was confident that I could hurt him enough to run off at least. But all that confidence faded to dust when he stood up. I forgot every single thing that I learned. He staggered a bit, losing his footing as he walked. In the rush of the moment, I started to kick both of my feet against the wall of the barn with all the strength of my legs, and actually broke through. He bolted towards me, and I jumped through the hole, breaking it completely open as I went through quickly. And I ran, and I didn't look back. I ran to the road, and then following the side of the road, I ran along the edge of the forest and straight to the cornfields. I thought he wouldn't be able to find me in the cornfields if he was behind me. I just kept running straight until I saw lights piercing through the cornfields like blinds. I followed it, and I found the farmhouse. The first person I saw was my mother, and I didn't stop running until I ran into her arms. Finally, to safety. It took a moment for me to realize that there were 2 police officers there. When my mother put me down on a chair, she screamed, noticing my injuries, which up until this point, I didn't notice at all. I had a large piece of wood piercing the loose flesh of my leg. I was severely bruised and scraped all over, bleeding profusely. Until it was pointed out, I strangely did not feel any pain at all. But once I did, I started to cry. They told me the ambulance was coming, and the police tried to get me to talk in the meanwhile. And I told him, while stuttering and fighting my tears. I told him I was in an abandoned barn, and there was a man that attacked me. I gave them details of whatever I could remember of the man, and I remembered him very well. The police went to check the barn, and when they came back, they seemed to be shaken and unusually quiet. The 2 policemen just looked at each other, and then called my parents aside to talk to them. They talked for a while. The ambulance finally arrived, and my parents came back to me as they pulled me out to the stretcher. They seemed almost frightened and shocked. I was taken away to the hospital. Once I was released and we went home, my parents never let me bring it up again. Not that I was completely willing to anyway, but it always stuck at the back of my mind. What did they find? Did the man escape? Why did they look so disturbed? A couple of years later, I asked my mother what the police officer had told her back then at the farm. My mother stared at me for a bit, as if she was deciding whether or not she should tell me. She parted her lips for a moment before speaking. The police told us that the man you described was found in the barn, at the back, leaning against the wall. She paused for a while. I simply thought about it during that long moment. The man must have backed off once I escaped. Dead, she blurted out, interrupting my thoughts. I felt my heart sink and my stomach twist. The police said that he must have been dead for at least a couple of weeks. I am now almost 18, and to this day, I don't know what I saw. Was it my imagination, or something else?
Number 3.
This happened to me in a campsite in Kentucky with my dad. We lived in a small town that you could blink and miss. In fact, it wasn't really a town at all. It just had some hollows, which is what we call streets that are nestled in between the mountains. We lived in a family holler called Grim Holler. I know, spooky, right? But it was honestly my grandmother's maiden name. We lived in a trailer, and our closest neighbour, my Uncle Bob, lived about 1.5 miles up the road. My grandmother had lived in Kentucky her whole life, born and raised, and a few years ago died. I moved there when I was 11, from Iowa. I lived there with my dad and her. She only had one leg due to diabetes, so I used to take her wheelchair to be a jerk. But to be honest, even in her old age, she got around just fine without it. But that sure didn't stop her from yelling at me. She was an old gypsy kind of woman, very superstitious. She used to tell me about how, when walking with someone down the street, never to let a pole come between you because it hurts your connection with that person. Even now, as a grown 24-year-old woman with no religious views, I find myself doing a lot of the stuff that she told me not to do. About a year ago, I came across a creepypasta that chilled me to the bones, something I hadn't put a lot of thought into, even when it happened. I'm sure you know it, the Goat Man. One night, my older cousin was telling me about some of the folklore Grams used to tell him. One of them being about this thing that lived in the woods that would trick you into following it so deep into the woods that you would get lost and never be found. And immediately, Grams gets very, very mad. She went off on a rant about how if you talk about it, it comes, and it's bad luck to even talk about it. Seeing how much this freaks her out, I press on just to mess with her. But I suddenly want to know all about this thing in the woods. Unfortunately though, she went on to never talk about it again, but my cousin told me the rest of the story later that night. A few days pass and I don't think about it a lot. I was more worried about bobcats than a made-up superstition about a goat monster in the woods. The property that we lived on was huge, and my dad had mowed this tall grass area so that we could have a campsite. We're out there, maybe a quarter mile from the trailer, but with how tall the grass was, you couldn't see it or anything around it. It had just gotten dark and we were cooking corn and hot dogs, and my dad went back up to the trailer to grab some buns. I never liked the dark, and with how much wildlife is in Kentucky, I was super pumped about being left there. After a little bit, I was hearing this gritting sound, like what someone makes when they're mumbling under their voice. Then I see the tall grass move just in front of me, but it was so dark that I couldn't see what was causing it. I kept telling myself it was rabbits. They're all over, so it must have been one. That was until the noise was just on the edge of the grass. There was this smell, this awful metal smell. It was like when my dad tossed beer cans into the fire. It was so strong, and the grass was moving more. I noticed something really weird too. It was like mid-August, and I couldn't hear anything other than the grass moving. No wind, no bugs or birds, nothing but the grass rustling. Then I saw my dad coming up the little trail. If it wasn't for me being frozen scared, I would have gotten up and hugged him. But immediately, he was mad at me, thinking that I tossed empty cans into the fire, which, being 11 at the time, I wasn't allowed to do. I tried to tell him that it wasn't me and that the smell had come out of nowhere. We were considering camping out there, but Graham said that we shouldn't camp out because the news said it was going to rain. So my dad dumped some water on the fire and we packed up, leaving the little tent. That night, there was a massive thunderstorm. The best thing about Kentucky thunderstorms is that when you're in the holler and surrounded by trees with no streetlights, and it's blackout and the lightning hits, it's like the middle of the day for like a good 2 to 3 seconds. You can only see past the first 2 tree lines depending on how bright the lightning is, but everything past that was still ink black. From my porch to the street that ran in front of my trailer was maybe 10 yards, then the tree line was pressed right against the other side of the road. I was sitting on the porch watching the storm, which I had done a few times before. I was still a little nervous about the grass. When the lightning hits, everything in our front yard to the second tree line is bright as day. And the second time is when I saw it. Standing behind the first tree line, there was something standing in the woods with their back to the house. Then it was pitch black again. I sit there, waiting for it to happen again. And that's when I smell it, that smell again. That awful blood and metal smell. Then the lightning and thunder hits again, and it was standing closer to the first set of trees. I was really confused and a little freaked out. Then it hit again. I thought for sure that it was going to be in my yard, just looking at me. But when I quickly scanned the woods, I saw it was gone. So I go into the trailer, not wanting to see where this weird person was going to pop up next. And I'm standing in the doorway in the kitchen where my grandmother is standing at the sink doing dishes. She looks at me and asks me why I'm not out watching the storm. I tell her that there's this weird person standing in the woods with their back to me. She looks at me, and in a split second, with one leg mind you, my grams rush to the back door and locks it, then past my dad on the couch and locks the front door. She tells my dad to lock the windows. He grumbles at first, but after a few choice words from Grams, gets up and does what he's told. She then took me into her room and shut the door and made me tell her everything. I tell her about the tall grass and the metal smell and how it came back when I was on the porch. I stayed in her room that night, and when I had to go to school on that Monday in the early morning when it was still dark, she made my dad stand out with me. We didn't camp out after that because the next morning the tent was destroyed. It looked like someone took scissors and ripped holes all over. My dad just chalked it up to the storm, but when my Uncle Bob found the tent zipper in his yard, my dad got a little freaked out. After finally reading up about the goat man, I can't tell you how I felt. Like I was so close to this thing. It was lurking in the grass, just a few feet from me. I wish my Grams was still here and I could tell her I believed her and I was sorry for making fun of her. So if you're ever in Whittinsville, Kentucky, please watch out.
Number 2.
I'm a senior in high school, and right now my class schedule is a mix of some AP classes and some easier electives. In my electives, there's usually a collective mix of people from all different grades, so I don't know a lot of the kids in my classes. There's one class in particular that I have with my best friend. The teacher is wonderful, the course load isn't too demanding, and it's an all-around fun class. That is, unless you count the kid I have to sit next to. We'll call this kid Brian. I knew on the first day of class that I did not like Brian. He interjects into class conversation in places where it's not needed, and with some really shitty jokes that he seems to think are hilarious. He's also the type of person who will repeat what he said over and over if he thinks everyone is ignoring him as a sign that they just didn't hear him. Now, you may be thinking that he has some sort of disability, but I can promise you, he doesn't. I'm no expert, but just knowing this kid, I can almost guarantee his only problem is impulse control. I was getting an A, the teacher loved me, and the rest of the kids in the class were actually very witty and intelligent. Nothing could ruin this class for me. But then, things started getting weird. The first incident happened pretty suddenly. Somehow, the topic of Islam came up, and Brian did a complete 180 from the shitty jokes and the unnecessary comments. He went on a rant about how Muslim people were no good psychos who blow up shit, and how they all needed to be eradicated, and a bunch of other insane shit. I was more pissed off than scared, and luckily, the bell rang soon after. I just joked about how idiotic he was for the rest of the day, and the incident was soon at the back of my mind. But that was far from the last time Brian lost it in class. I noticed that Brian had a very explosive temper. He sleeps almost every day in class, which of course is frowned upon. So, the first time this happened, the kid behind him woke him up, and Brian flipped his shit. He went absolutely ballistic on the kid behind him, yelling at him, calling him a fag, telling him to suck his dick, yelling at him to go fuck himself, and just in general abusing this poor kid. I've seen some high school boys yell at each other before, of course, but this was so much different. I've never seen someone blow up so easily at such a minor thing before. The more other people in the class began to dislike Brian, the worse he got. One girl in particular, I'll call her Catherine, snaps at him nearly every day. It's the same daily routine. She'll turn around in her seat, insult him, and then turn back to face the front of the class. When she does this, I always have to brace myself to see Brian's face turn into a mask of pure rage and hatred that is truly terrifying to see on somebody so young. Then, after this, he'll begin mumbling things. I've been pretty freaked out by the things that I've heard him mumbling. Over the weeks, he had several more angry outbursts. All of these incidents I could ignore. It wasn't until recently that Brian transformed from a minor annoyance into an actual concern. One day, he was reading a book during class when someone told him to put it down and pay attention. He yelled louder than I've ever heard him yell before.
I am paying attention.
He continued to scream so loudly that the teacher had to finally get him to calm down, and even he looked disturbed. After he finally stopped yelling, Brian just put both hands to his head, closing his eyes, squeezing inward and hissing, "Shut up, over and over again. And I do mean hissing. It sounded so malicious that I had to look away. My concern spiked when we had to do a group assignment. We formed a group of 8 people based on how close together we were in the room, and Brian was in our group. After we finished the assignment, we got off track, talking about where we planned to go after we finished high school. My friend and I, being the only 2 seniors in the group, we were really the only ones who had any sort of idea. My friend shared that she planned to go into the military after graduation because she had no other way to pay for college. Brian spoke up and said, word for word,
I want to go in the military because I want to know what it's like to kill people.
We were all pretty taken aback by this. If he had said it some other way, we may have laughed it off, but he was dead serious. There was no inflection in his voice. It was just flat, like he was telling us he had a bagel for breakfast or something else mundane like that. I quickly interjected and told him that even if he does go into the military, he's unlikely to ever kill someone. He actually looked pissed at this. Like, really pissed. Needless to say, I've never seen someone look angry at the prospect of not killing people, and I sure as shit don't want to see it again. My friend and I began to joke about how he was likely to become a school shooter one day, and how we hoped he waited until we graduated, but our jokes were an attempt to cover up the genuine concern that we both had. Every time he stood up, or asked to go to the bathroom, or reached into his backpack, we both flinched. Last week, Brian didn't show up for class. We thought he was absent, but word travels fast in high school. We soon learned that he was suspended and could possibly have criminal charges pressed against him. We didn't know why, so I took it upon myself to ask a few people in his grade what he had done. I suspected that he got into a fight or sassed a teacher, but the real reason had me in near hysterics. He really had threatened to shoot up the school, beginning with his first class, my class.
Number 1.
Ever since I was a child, I've seen and experienced things that have defied rational explanation. I consider myself a skeptic, and for the sake of conversation, often describe myself as a spiritual atheist. What I mean by this is, I don't believe in any sort of creator, supreme being, intelligent design, or anything like that. I don't scoff at those who do believe in these things. I just personally have never experienced anything in my life that I could attribute to the actions of a higher power. That being said, I do believe in some sort of spiritual form of thermodynamics. Much past that, I don't know what I do or don't believe. One of my earliest memories as a child, I'm roughly 5 years old, living in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. I'm in my father's office waiting for him to finish briefing his team. Being bored and restless, I gaze outside of the window up a hill towards what is called the tank farm, where a number of large silos are stored. Leading from the tank farm is a promenade that comes down the side of the hill. Coming down the promenade, I see 2 figures. A woman in hand with a child, both wearing early 20th century period clothing. I watch as they walk down the hill and past the window, only a short distance from where I was sitting. Moments after they walked from where I was sitting, they vanished into thin air. I remember not being scared, more just perplexed by what I had just witnessed. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen, but I did ask my father if there was anything else up at the tank farm, wondering if maybe anyone lived up there, or if there were any other buildings. He told me that the only other thing on top of the hill by the tank farm was a cemetery. Being raised on an island in Alaska, we were trained for earthquake preparation and tsunami evacuation procedures. We would always have a 3-day survival pack at the ready at all times. My mother woke me up numerous times in the middle of the night due to earthquakes. The largest earthquake I experienced on the island was a magnitude of 6.9. After every earthquake, we would always have to evacuate to the school, which is located on one of the higher points of the island. This detail may seem arbitrary, but it's somewhat relevant later. We moved to a small town in the North Cascade Mountains, near the US-Canadian border, around the time I was in the 3rd grade. The house we were living in was unsettling for various reasons. Right before moving in, the previous tenants were involved in a major drug bust. The DEA and the FBI were both involved with the raid. The authorities apparently seized nearly 400 kilos of cocaine after everything was said and done. The only reason we moved into this house was it was already owned by our family, and we really had nowhere else to go. After the federal agents collected everything and convicted all those who were involved with the illegal activities, we were able to move back in. The house was filled with garbage. Everything was destroyed. Beds, tables, chairs, everything, all broken. After going through the entire house, I remember talking to my mother and telling her that we lived in a dump and weeping. My mother had a few $1,000s saved up from selling her small business in Alaska, so we didn't take much time to get the house back to living condition. Just lots of blood, sweat and tears. Life soon returned to normal, relatively speaking. Late one night, I woke up from a heavy sleep. Someone was banging on our front door. I went to answer it, and it was a woman covered in blood. I let her in, covered her in a towel and sat her down in the dining room. I then went to my mother's bedroom and woke her up. I laugh when I think about it now. Your 8-year-old child waking you up in the middle of the night to tell you that you let someone covered in blood into your house. Obviously, she panicked and rushed to assess the situation. Apparently, it was a girl in her mid to late 20s who was intoxicated while driving and crashed her car. When she regained consciousness, she walked well over a mile to try to get help. The woman's recollection of the events was vague at best, but from the sounds of it, she tried 3 or 4 other houses before coming to ours. Obviously, my mother had a talk with me about not letting strangers in the house, especially in the middle of the night, and even more especially if they're covered in blood. She hugged me and told me good job. The person may well have died from blood loss and or hypothermia had I not woken up. The medics came, bandaged her up, and hauled her off on a gurney and neck brace. I never found out what happened to her after that, but it was just good to know that I helped someone. Once again, life returned to normal. Roughly a month goes by, and I start waking up in the middle of the night. I get this weird sensation that someone is watching me. I sit up in my bed and look around. It's completely silent, but I notice the outside motion sensor floodlight in the driveway right outside my window is on. I shrug it off and go back to sleep, figuring it's probably a deer outside or something. Nothing happens for the next week. The following week, I start waking up at 3:15 every morning with the same feeling of being watched again. And again, with the floodlight on every time. I start falling asleep with my head under the blanket so the light doesn't wake me up in the middle of the night, and I once again am able to sleep through the night undisturbed. About a month goes by and nothing happens. One night, while watching TV around 8:30 p.m, I'm on the couch which faces the hallway to my bedroom. I get the feeling of being watched again. As I gaze down the hallway, I see the shadow of someone standing to the right of the doorway of my bedroom. I close my eyes in disbelief, not sure if what I saw was real. Opening my eyes, I refocus my sight to the end of the hallway to see nothing there. Shrugging it off, I chalk it up to my eyes playing tricks on me. I go to bed, completely forgetting about what I saw earlier in the evening, and I go to sleep. 3:15 a.m. comes around again, and I wake up again with that same unsettling feeling of being watched. Again, with the floodlight on. I sit up in bed and look around. Normally it's silent, but this night is different. I hear the sound of footsteps leaving the bedroom, going down the hallway past the washer and dryer and to the living room. Covering my head again, I close my eyes tight to go back to sleep. When I woke up the following morning, I asked my mother if she was walking around in the middle of the night. "Of course not," she said, looking at me with a puzzled expression on her face. "Why do you ask?" she says. Nothing. I just thought I heard something." She tries to reassure me that it was nothing. It was probably just the house settling or something. With that sounding like a reasonable explanation, I think nothing more of it. Nothing happens for a few days. I wake up though at 3:15 to the same feeling of dread. Again, I put my head under the blankets to try to go back to sleep. I'm nearly asleep again, and all of a sudden, my bed shakes violently. I wake up in a panic and hear footsteps down the hallway. I get up and follow them, dazed and half asleep. In my half asleep state, I assume it's my mother waking me up because of an earthquake. Following the footsteps in a panic, expecting to meet my mother, I came to the living room to find nothing. Moonlight is shining through the blinds. It's eerily silent. After standing in the dark for a few moments, trying to comprehend what the hell just happened, I ran back to my room in a panic to hide under my blankets. The following morning, my mother comments that I seem more tired than normal. I asked her if she was in my room last night and if she tried to move my bed. When she finally realized that I was being serious, she all of a sudden became very pale in the face. Again, she tried to shrug it off and explained it away with the house settling. The following night, I slept undisturbed, but when I woke up the following morning, I found my mother in the dining room with tired, bloodshot eyes, drinking coffee with her hands shaking a little. Is everything okay, Mum? She just replied with, "It woke me up." We didn't say anything after that. Following the blessing, nothing like that happened again, although I did continue to see shadows at the end of the hallway from time to time, and I did continue to wake up at least once a week in the middle of the night to the same silence, and as always, the floodlight was on. Eventually, we moved to a town an hour away. The first day we were in the house, I was sitting on the couch watching TV. My mother was in the dining room. In between us was a long, narrow kitchen. We had a wastebasket with a large plastic flipper lid. The lid suddenly flew directly across the room and slammed against the opposite wall. The wastebasket didn't move at all. My mother and I looked at each other in silence for a few minutes. She then broke the long silence by saying, "That must be the welcoming committee." That was the only thing that I personally experienced in that house, though I could always hear footsteps above me as my bedroom was in the basement, even when I knew no one was home. Whenever I had friends over for the evening, they would tell me afterwards that they felt claustrophobic, smothered, suffocated, or just had a feeling of dread and anxiety in my room. Most of my friends would not want to come back over for a sleepover after. When I would leave overnight for a sleepover or go on vacation to see my father during the summers, my mother described the house as very active, but wouldn't elaborate other than to say that she hid in the corner of her bedroom on more than one occasion. During high school, we moved to a town near the Puget Sound. Our house was very small. My bedroom was barely large enough to fit a twin-size bed and a desk. The bedroom was attached to a small narrow laundry room, which was then attached to the water closet. I used to joke about sleeping in a hole behind the water heater. My room had a sliding door which could be locked from the inside. The room has 2 awning windows without screens. I would usually prop one open with a drumstick to get fresh air. Also, on occasions, I would sneak out of the window at night to meet with friends for parties. To climb back in, I would have to get a sawhorse so I would be high enough to be able to pull myself into my room, as the windows were over 6 feet from the ground outside. At night, I started hearing what sounded like footsteps outside of my window. I initially attributed it to deer, but the more I listened to it, the more it sounded like something bipedal. One day, I had a couple of my friends over to make some music. We were all in the living room playing thrash metal and punk rock. In the middle of the jam, I heard a loud shriek. And it was loud because I clearly heard it over the guitar, drums, and bass. The music slowly came to a stop and I looked over to the bass player and asked, "You heard that, right? Was that you?" To which he replied, "No, I thought that was you." We turned to the guitarist, who heard the shriek as well, and he turned pale and said, "You guys are just messing with me, right?" Our jam session came to an abrupt end, and they left right away. A few weeks later, I was sitting at my computer in my bedroom, chatting with my friends. I glanced over to see 2 glowing red eyes peering into my bedroom. I panicked and turned off my computer and turned all of the lights off and grabbed my knife. As soon as all the lights were off, the red eyes turned and walked away. Later on in the night, I heard a growl outside. That was the last time that I kept my window open in the middle of the night. A few weeks later, I had a vivid dream of a disembodied voice demanding me to get out, go away. In the dream, I was screaming back at it, refusing to leave because it was my house and I was going to stand my ground. The following morning, I woke up and I was extremely sore and tired. I went to the bathroom and noticed a number of small contusions on my arm. As I inspected it, I noticed that the contusions were in the shape of a handprint with what was most likely the thumb pointing to my elbow, giving the impression that someone tried to grab me from behind with their left hand. I attempted to contort my arm to see if there was any way I could possibly do this to myself, but I for the life of me could not. I then was about to walk away when I noticed out of the corner of my eye in the mirror 3 long scratches in the middle of my back, right down the entire length of my spine. From there on, I spent as little time in that house as possible, sofa surfing at friends' houses. Due to the years of stress and paranoia, my doctor prescribed me some selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. I must admit, life is much more boring for me these days. I work full-time and have a child who is now in elementary school. I haven't experienced anything remotely paranormal in a long time. I often wonder if it's due to the SSRIs either blocking some sort of perception I previously had, or possibly everything I experienced throughout the years was just some sort of manifestation of my stress, anxiety, paranoia, and depression. I often entertain the thought of the former, but I'm really not sure what to think. All I know is, as I stand here, I know what I saw. Glowing red eyes from a creature nearly 7 feet tall. I know I had contusions and scratches on my arms and shoulders while I was asleep, locked from the inside without the possibility of anyone coming in while I sleep. At the end of the day, you can choose to believe me or not. And as a skeptic, if I heard someone tell the same story, I would probably call bullshit. But all of these events have puzzled me for years.